The winter of 1945 pressed heavily against the frozen plains of Wisconsin, where snowflakes drifted across barbed wire fences and watchtowers loomed like silent sentinels. A convoy of American military trucks crawled along the icy road toward a sprawling prison camp. Inside the covered transports, dozens of German women sat in silence, their breath rising in pale clouds. They were nurses, secretaries, wives of officers, women bound to the machinery of the Reich, now broken under relentless fire. Their uniforms were torn, their shoes patched, their bodies frail from weeks of hunger and fear. Among them sat Liesl Weber, 26 years old, her fingers clutching a thin wool scarf pulled tight against her throat. She dared not raise her eyes to the guards waiting beyond the gates. Since childhood, she had been told what awaited if ever captured. Teachers described Americans as brutes who would strip women of dignity, humiliate them, starve them, reduce them to less than human. Propaganda films had painted them as grotesque caricatures, greedy, violent, dishonorable men. Those warnings echoed now, with every creak of the truck. Liesl's stomach twisted as the engine died and the doors swung open. Floodlights cut across the snow, illuminating rifles slung over American shoulders. The women shuffled down heads, bowed, convinced each step was carrying them deeper into a nightmare. The orders were curt, but not cruel. Line up, move forward, collect your belongings. Yet suspicion clung to every gesture. Whispers broke out. This was only the prelude, the softness before the punishment. Liesl's pulse thundered in her ears as she crossed the threshold of the camp, bracing herself for the brutality she had always believed inevitable. Instead, what awaited was something neither she nor any of the women had imagined. The gates of the camp groaned as they opened, and the line of women was herded forward into the bitter Wisconsin night. Snow crunched beneath their worn shoes, some barely holding together after months of forced marches and improvised repairs. Liesl Weber felt her knees tremble as the harsh beam of a searchlight swept across her face. She lowered her gaze instantly, afraid that even the briefest glance might invite a rifle butt to her ribs. But instead of blows or curses, a voice spoke through an interpreter, calm, clipped, and strangely bureaucratic. "Line up here. Follow the path. Wait for your turn." The words carried no warmth, but neither did they carry the venom she had braced for. Inside the wooden processing building, warmth seeped from a coal stove, the scent of smoke mingling with something almost unimaginable soap. The women blinked in confusion as American clerks sat behind desks, ink pens scratching across ledgers. Each prisoner was called by name, or at least the fractured version of it captured in hurried translation. Liesl's turn came and she stepped forward with her heart hammering. She gave her name, her age, her occupation, and waited for the slap, the sneer, the insult she had always been told would follow. But the clerk only nodded, scrawled the details on a page, and waved her aside. Next came the medical checks. A doctor with wire-rimmed glasses and a Red Cross armband motioned for her to sit. His hands were brisk, efficient, but not cruel. He listened to her chest, pressed his fingers to her pulse, peered into her eyes. She winced, half expecting some violation disguised as treatment, but none came. Instead, he murmured something she could not understand, scribbled notes, and moved on. Her throat tightened, confused by this absence of brutality. Could indifference feel like mercy? The line moved forward again. Women were handed bundles of clothing, a wool skirt, blouse, sweater, a heavy coat marked with large white letters, PW. Shoes clean, socks, blankets thick enough to chase away the gnawing cold. Liesl touched the coat's coarse fabric, stunned by its sturdiness. Her own garments were threadbare rags patched so many times they barely clung together. A small gasp escaped her lips, quickly swallowed, for fear it might betray weakness. Around her, other women clutched their new belongings with the same disbelief, as if they had been given treasures stolen from a dream. Yet beneath the surprise, fear coiled tighter. "This cannot be real," whispered a voice inside her. "It is too simple, too civilized. Surely this is only the beginning, the deception before the cruelty." The women exchanged glances but said little. Every kind gesture, every ordinary act of procedure felt like a trick, Liesel pulled the coat around her shoulders, but the warmth did not reach her chest. In her mind echoed the warnings of her teachers. The Americans would strip them, mock them, grind them into dust, until they begged for death. This orderliness, this strange civility, could only be the mask before the true face appeared. They were led from station to station, the sound of boots echoing against wooden floors. One woman whispered a prayer, her voice trembling, while another bit her lip until blood marked her teeth. No one dared speak aloud the thought that haunted them all, that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare had not yet arrived. Their bodies relaxed slightly with each unexpected kindness, yet their spirits remained wound tight, bracing for the blow. When at last they were escorted into a barracks, the sight stole the breath from many throats. Rows of bunks lined with mattresses, blankets folded neatly at the foot. A coal stove glowed softly in the center heat, spreading like an impossible luxury. Some women sat stiffly on the edges of the beds, too frightened to lie down, afraid that closing their eyes would invite punishment. Liesel gripped the frame of her bunk, her fingers trembling. She could not remember the last time she had seen sheets without holes, or a fire tended for comfort rather than survival. Still, the unease gnawed at her. The mattress seemed too soft, the sheets too clean, the warmth too generous. Surely this was a test designed to break them when it was all ripped away. She lay awake, listening for footsteps, for the slam of the door, for the beginning of whatever horror the Reich had promised would come. Around her she could hear quiet sobs muffled into pillows, the sound of women trying not to believe what their eyes saw. And yet, as the night deepened, exhaustion took hold. One by one, the women surrendered to sleep, their bodies too starved for rest to resist. The barracks filled with the soft rhythm of breathing, fragile and uneven, but real. For the first time in months, perhaps years, Liesel closed her eyes on a bed that did not shake with gunfire or reek of rot. She drifted between fear and relief, unsure which would claim her by morning. The coat lay heavy across her chest, and still she whispered into the darkness, "It is only the beginning. They will show their cruelty tomorrow." But when dawn came, the light that filtered through the frosted windows revealed not chains or punishments, but another set of American voices calling them forward. The nightmare had not arrived, and that absence was its own kind of terror. For in every moment of gentleness, Liesel could not escape the certainty that something darker still lay ahead. The civility of her captors felt too steady, too deliberate, as if every act of mercy were designed to tighten the suspense. The question pressed harder than the cold ever could. What awaited them next beyond this careful facade? The dawn that followed was pale and unforgiving light, spilling weakly across the frost-laced windows of the barracks. The women stirred one by one, stiff from fear more than sleep, clutching the coarse blankets that had shielded them through the night. Liesel Weber lay awake long before the first call, her eyes fixed on the ceiling beams above her. The fire in the stove had died down to embers, but its memory lingered in the room, a warmth that felt out of place. She had expected a night of torment punishments drawn out to remind them of their defeat. Instead, there had only been silence. That silence, however, was not peace. It was suspense, the kind of hush that comes before a storm. The women spoke little as they were roused. Each one moved like a shadow, their new coats hanging heavily on their shoulders, their eyes downcast. Somewhere in the line someone whispered that today they would be taken for grooming. The word slithered through the barracks, unsettling, incomprehensible in its ambiguity. Grooming. To American ears it might have meant care, cleanliness, civility, but to German women taught in classrooms of the Reich, the word was poisoned. They remembered the stories told by teachers, by party officials, by the posters plastered on walls in bombed-out cities. Americans were animals, they said, hungry and dishonorable men who would defile their women and laugh at their shame. Grooming could only mean degradation, a ritual of humiliation. Liesel's stomach clenched as the memory surged. She was a girl again, seated in a cold schoolroom in Bavaria, her teacher's voice sharp as a bayonet. "If you are ever captured, remember," he had told them, "the enemy has no honor. They will strip you of your hair, your dignity, your womanhood. Better to die first than face such shame." Those words had seemed distant, once warnings meant for other people. But now, standing in the heart of her enemy's camp, with guards waiting at the door, They felt like prophecy. The line moved slowly, boots tapping against wooden floors, the air heavy with dread. A young woman ahead of Liesel stumbled, her knees giving way. Another caught her by the arm and whispered something too soft to hear, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Every step toward the unknown carried the weight of inevitability. Some women prayed under their breath, murmured words to saints and angels, as if they might shield them from what lay ahead. Others pressed their lips together until they bled, determined not to show weakness when the cruelty began. The barracks that had seemed almost bearable the night before now felt like a chamber of suspense, every wall echoing with the stories they had carried from home. One of the older prisoners, Marta, a widow from Hamburg, broke the silence in a whisper that trembled like dry leaves. "They will shave us," she said. "Mark us like cattle." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group, soft and despairing. Another woman covered her face with her hands rocking silently as tears slid through her fingers. In their minds they saw themselves stripped, bare, mocked, turned into grotesque parodies of womanhood. Liesel felt her throat tighten until she could barely swallow. She pictured herself without hair, without the small shields of dignity that remained after war had already stolen her home, her family, her future. When the guards finally entered, the air shifted violently. The thud of boots, the sharp order through an interpreter, prepare, follow, line up, cut into the women like knives. They rose in silence, clutching their coats tighter around them. No one resisted, but every movement carried the weight of dread. The walk across the yard felt endless. Snow crunched underfoot, breath hung in the air like smoke, and not a sound came from the line, except the occasional choked sob of someone who could no longer contain it. Liesel glanced sideways and saw a girl no older than 18, her lips moving quickly in prayer. Another woman had her jaw set, eyes glazed with something between rage and despair. Each of them carried their own terror, but none dared speak it aloud. The silence was more eloquent than words, a silence built from 1,000 warnings, carried across seas and through bombed streets, warnings that had grown into truth inside their minds. The building they approached loomed larger with each step, a low-structure steam rising faintly from vents on its roof. The word grooming echoed again in Liesel's head, sharper, this time heavier. She braced herself as the door creaked open and heat spilled into the cold air. It was unbearable, the not knowing the weight of anticipation. Better cruelty revealed itself quickly, she thought, than this slow torture of waiting. As the line moved toward the threshold, hearts pounded like drums. The women clutched their blankets, their coats, the last fragments of themselves, as if they could ward off the humiliation they believed inevitable. Tears slid silently down some faces. Others closed their eyes, already retreating inward, preparing for the moment when the world would collapse upon them. Liesel's hand trembled as she touched the doorframe, the thought pounding in her mind. This is it. This is where they strip us of everything that remains. And yet just beyond that doorway something waited, something entirely outside the realm of what they had been taught to expect. They could not know it yet, but the moment of reckoning that haunted their dreams was about to be rewritten in a way none of them could have foreseen. The door swung open with a heavy creak, and a gust of warm air spilled into the corridor, wrapping itself around the shivering line of women. For a heartbeat they froze at the threshold, blinded by the sudden brightness that poured from within. The room ahead gleamed with white tiles polished so clean they reflected the light like glass. Steam drifted upward in lazy curls from vents along the ceiling, and the scent, faint, almost unbelievable, hit them at once. Soap, real soap. Not the ash and grit they had rubbed into their skin back home. Not the acrid substitutes that scratched instead of cleansed. It was a fragrance so alien, it made their throats tighten. For a moment, no one moved. Inside, the interpreter commanded, and the guards gestured toward the doorway. The women shuffled forward in hesitant steps, their eyes darting, searching for the cruelty they were certain must be hidden there. Liesel's pulse thudded in her ears. Every lesson from her childhood screamed that this was the trap, the humiliation dressed in civility. Grooming, they had said. This was the moment they would be stripped, mocked, reduced. She clutched the edge of her coat until her knuckles turned white, bracing for the blow. Instead, a bundle was pressed into her hands, a folded towel, soft and thick, and something smooth, white, and fragrant. Ivory soap. Liesel stared down at it in disbelief, her fingers tracing the perfect edges of the bar. The last time she had held anything like it, she had been a girl helping her mother scrub linens in the river, years before bombs had turned her city to rubble. Around her, the other women clutched their towels and soap like contraband, wide-eyed, afraid to believe it was real. One by one, they stepped into stalls divided by curtains. The hiss of water filled the room, steady and abundant. Liesel lingered at the edge of her stall, trembling. She expected a guard to yank the curtain aside to laugh, as she fumbled to bark insults in a language she barely understood. But no one came. The water continued to flow, patient, generous. With a hesitant breath, she extended her hand, and warmth poured over her skin. She gasped, pulling back her body, shocked by the sudden gentleness of it. Slowly, she reached again, letting the stream run across her fingers, then her wrist, then her entire arm. It had been months since she had felt anything like it. Cold rivers, icy rain, hurried splashes, from basins that was all war had allowed. But this was warmth that enveloped her. Warmth that did not demand, did not punish, did not vanish in an instant. She pressed the bar of soap to her skin, and the lather blossomed in her hands, smooth and rich, carrying with it a scent that struck deep into her memory. It smelled of home, of summers when her mother hung linens in the sun, of small moments untouched by war. Tears blurred her vision as she rubbed the suds across her arms. From the stalls nearby came muffled sobs, the sound of women breaking beneath the weight of forgotten comforts. One whispered, her voice shaking, "This is the smell we lost." Another let out a cry so raw it cut through the hiss of water. "I thought I would never feel this again." Their voices mingled with the rhythm of the shower, grief and relief, colliding in the steam-filled air. Liesel leaned her forehead against the tile, her shoulders trembling as the water cascaded over her. The dirt of months began to slip away, dark streaks swirling into the drain. But it was more than grime that washed from her. It was the feeling of being less than human, the weight of filth that had clung not only to her skin, but to her soul. The water stripped it away layer by layer until she felt bare and fragile, but also unmistakably alive. When she emerged from the stall, the towel wrapped around her body, she looked at her reflection in the small mirror mounted on the wall. For a moment she did not recognize the woman staring back. Her face, once dulled by soot and hunger, now glistened with droplets that caught the light. Her hair damp and heavy-framed eyes that were tired but no longer hollow. She lifted the bar of soap again, holding it like a relic, as though afraid it might vanish if she blinked. Around her, other women clutched their towels, closed their faces wet, not only from the water, but from tears they no longer tried to hide. Some smiled weakly at one another, tentative and fleeting, but real. It was not joy. They had lost too much for that. But it was recognition, a spark of shared humanity, flickering where despair had once reigned. As the guards led them back toward the barracks, no one spoke. The silence was not the same as before. It was heavy, but no longer with dread. It was filled with something unspoken, a fragile awareness that the world was not as they had been told. They had expected humiliation, degradation, the stripping away of every shred of dignity. Instead, they had been given warmth, cleanliness, and the faintest glimpse of humanity. For Liesel, the experience cut deeper than she could admit. If the enemy could offer soap and water instead of cruelty, then perhaps the stories she had been raised to believe were lies. That thought was more terrifying than any punishment she had braced for, because it meant the world was not as simple as she had been taught, and the battle she faced now was not only for survival, but for truth itself. The barbed wire around the camp was real. The guards with their rifles were real, but so too was the fragrance of soap that still lingered on her skin. And that contradiction was more disorienting than any nightmare she had ever imagined. They had barely recovered from the bewilderment of the showers when the guards gestured for them to move again, their damp hair clinging to their cheeks, towels wrapped tightly around their trembling bodies. Liesel Weber clutched her bundle of new clothing, expecting to be marched straight back to the barracks. The clean skin, the warmth of water, the faint scent of ivory, still clinging to her hands. Surely it was more than they deserved. Surely it was the end of the illusion. Yet instead of retracing their steps, the line of women was guided down another corridor toward a building humming with faint noise and lit windows that glowed against the winter dusk. The door opened, and what lay inside struck them silent. Rows of chairs lined the room, not the rough benches of a prison hall, but cushioned seats like those from photographs in magazines. Tables stood beside them, crowded with bottles and brushes, combs and curling irons, tiny jars of polish and shades of rose and pearl. The air smelled of lavender talc and something sweeter, something foreign. And standing beside each chair were women, not guards, not doctors, but American women in plain uniforms, their hair tucked neatly, their hands folded with nervous anticipation. They smiled hesitantly, as though they themselves were uncertain of their place here. For a long moment no one moved. The German prisoners stared, their expressions blank with disbelief. This was the moment they thought the mask pulled tighter. Beauty offered to prisoners. No, it had to be a trick, a cruel joke before the humiliation. Marta whispered. They will shave us after all, mock us while they do it. Liesel felt her chest constrict, her body braced for betrayal. But the interpreter's voice broke the silence. These women are volunteers. They will cut your hair neatly, clean your nails, offer grooming. They believe every woman deserves dignity, even prisoners. The words fell like stones in a still pond, ripples spreading through the group. Dignity. A word they had almost forgotten. A word replaced by hunger, by loss, by war. Liesel could hardly comprehend it. She had expected laughter, jeers, the stripping away of the fragile self she clung to. Instead, a hand gestured gently for her to sit. She moved as if in a dream, lowering herself into the chair. The cushion gave beneath her weight, unfamiliar and oddly comforting. An American woman, perhaps no older than Liesel herself, approached with a comb in one hand. Her eyes flickered with uncertainty, but her voice was soft. "You are safe," she said through halting German, or perhaps only through tone, for Liesel understood it without words. The comb touched her hair, pulling carefully through the damp strands. It was not the tug of cruelty, but the patience of care. Liesel's throat ached. Her eyes stung, and she blinked rapidly to keep the tears from spilling. Around her, others sat rigid as their nails were filed, their hands gently held, their cuticles softened with oils they had never seen before. A girl with cracked lips gasped as a tube of lipstick was pressed into her hand, crimson against her pale skin. "No," she whispered at first, shaking her head. But the volunteer only smiled, uncapping it, brushing the color lightly onto her mouth. The girl's eyes widened at her reflection in the small mirror offered to her. For the first time in years, her face did not look like a prisoner's, it looked like a woman's. The silence of the room began to fracture. A stifled giggle escaped from one corner, uncertain but alive. Another followed, and soon the air filled with the fragile sound of laughter. Laughter that trembled on the edge of sobs. Liesel felt her lips curve upward against her will as the American brushed her hair into soft waves. She caught her own reflection and scarcely recognized it. Her cheeks were still hollow, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights, but there was a spark there she thought had died long ago. The transformation was not in the polish or the lipstick alone, but in what they represented. Every stroke of the brush, every touch of color, was a defiance against the narrative they had carried from home. They had been told they were enemies, subhuman, unworthy of mercy. Yet here enemy women placed combs in their hair, paint on their nails, as though they mattered, as though their humanity was not erased by the war. Marta, the widow who had sworn the Americans would degrade them, now sat with her fingers spread wide, staring at the soft pink sheen on her nails. Tears ran unchecked down her cheeks, and she laughed through them, a sound brittle but beautiful. A younger prisoner touched her own lips with trembling hands, whispering, "It feels like I am someone else." The volunteers, too, seemed changed. They had approached with caution, unsure if their gestures would be rejected. But as the women began to respond, as fragile smiles broke across faces once frozen in fear, their movements grew surer. Brushes moved with confidence, polish glistened, lipstick bloomed like flowers in winter. One American leaned close to another and murmured, "They look like girls at a dance." Liesel's heart tightened at that. A dance. The word carried her back to nights before the bombs, before uniforms, and propaganda, when she had worn dresses, her mother mended and laughed in the town square. She had thought that girl gone forever, buried beneath rubble and ash. But as she saw her reflection, now lips softened by red hair curling gently around her face, she realized the girl still lingered somewhere inside her. The session stretched on time, suspended in the glow of lamps and the hum of quiet voices. For once, the camp did not feel like a prison, but like something impossibly distant from war, a sanctuary carved out of contradiction. And as they were finally led away, their nails painted, their lips bright, their hair brushed smooth, the air was different. It was lighter, carrying the sound of quiet laughter that still clung to them. Yet beneath the fragile joy was an undercurrent of confusion that would not let go. If the enemy was capable of this, of treating them not as spoils but as women, then what else had been a lie? Liesel walked back toward the barracks, her heart pulled between gratitude and fear. The lipstick still tingled on her lips, a reminder that she was alive, that she was more than a prisoner. But in the back of her mind, the question lingered heavy and unshakable. If kindness could come from the hands of those she had been taught to hate, then what truths remained in the world she had once believed in? The first time had left them. Speechless, the second uncertain, but by the third week, the ritual no longer felt like an aberration. It had become a strange ceremony, woven into the rhythm of their captivity. Saturday afternoons, when the guards escorted them across the yard, a different kind of anticipation stirred in the barracks. It was not joy, not quite, but a restless awareness that something unusual, something impossible in the world beyond the wire awaited them. The Salon. Liesel Weber could feel it, even in the way the women dressed that morning, pulling their coats a little tighter, smoothing the wrinkles from their skirts, tucking loose strands of hair behind their ears. She watched Marta, the widow from Hamburg, who once spat at the idea of lipstick, sneak a glance into a shard of mirror before they left. Pride still clung stubbornly to Marta's shoulders, but her fingers betrayed her, hovering near her lips, as if remembering the faint shine of color. When they entered the salon, the smell of lavender and soap wrapped around them like an embrace. The American volunteers greeted them with the same hesitant smiles, brushes, and combs, already laid out bottles of polish lined in neat rows like soldiers. The women took their seats without resistance now, though they still avoided meeting each other's eyes too, directly, as if ashamed of the small relief they allowed themselves. Liesel sat down and felt the comb slip once again through her hair, the strokes steady and gentle. She closed her eyes and let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Whispers began to creep into the silence. At first, simple words exchanged between prisoner and volunteer, fumbling across the barrier of language. A thank you in broken English. A beautiful whispered in reply, fingers tapping the painted nails to emphasize. The women began to mimic the words, giggling softly when they stumbled, repeating them under their breath as though tasting a secret. Those words, so ordinary, so small, carried a weight far heavier than they appeared. They were cracks in the wall of propaganda that had enclosed their lives. Magazines were passed into their hands, glossy pages filled with photographs that belonged to another world. American families gathered in sunlit kitchens, children smiling with full plates before them, women in dresses that seemed to float with color, even in black and white print. A refrigerator gleamed behind one woman, its shelves stacked with food, as though hunger had never existed. Liesel traced her finger along the image, her throat tightening. Back in Germany, her mother had lined up for hours to bring home bread that crumbled to dust in her hands, while sirens screamed overhead. The contrast cut deep, so deep it felt like betrayal to admit. She glanced at Marta, who flipped through the pages with a scowl, muttering that it was all lies staged to weaken them. Yet, Liesel saw the way Marta lingered, on a photograph of a living room, a family seated by a glowing radio. Marta's hand trembled as she turned the page. Her lips pressed tight against words she refused to speak. Others could not hide their awe. Young Anna, barely 18, held up a picture of a bride in a white dress, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I wanted this once." Another leaned closer, her eyes shining, as she touched an advertisement for soap that promised softer skin. "They have so much," she murmured, "so much they can give it away." But there was resistance too. One nurse from Berlin, stern-faced and unyielding, refused the lipstick each week. She called it dishonor, a stain upon their pride. As German women, she held her head high, declaring that painted lips were the mark of surrender. Yet even she, once dismissive, began to linger longer by the mirror when her hair was brushed into soft waves. Liesel caught her one evening rubbing her lips together after secretly dabbing on a shade of red left behind on the table. The defiance was fading, eroded not by force but by the steady drip of gentleness. The contradictions gnawed at them. They had been taught to see Americans as monsters, weak men propped up by machines, women corrupted by excess. Yet here they were, combing their hair, filing their nails, pressing into their hands, magazines full of abundance. If this was weakness, it was a weakness stronger than anything Germany had mustered in years. Each gesture undermined the certainty they clung to, leaving only questions they dared not voice aloud. Liesel felt it most in the quiet moments. Sitting in the chair, the brush tugging softly at her scalp, she remembered her home reduced to rubble, her mother's hands cracked and bleeding from washing with ash and cold water. And here, in the heart of enemy land, she was treated like a woman. Again, not a prisoner, not a captive, but a woman with a face to be softened, hands to be cared for, lips to be brightened. The shame of accepting it wrestled with the relief of feeling human once more. She wanted to turn away, to reject it, to prove she was still loyal to the world she had been raised in. But when the mirror showed her reflection, her hair falling in waves, her nails glistening faintly, she could not deny the flicker of something long-buried hope. By the time they were escorted back across the yard, the winter air biting at their painted lips, silence returned to the group. Yet it was no longer the silence of dread. It was the silence of thoughts too heavy to voice, of beliefs unraveling thread by thread. Some clung harder to their pride, whispering that it was all deception. Others, like Liesel, walked with their eyes lowered, afraid to admit even to themselves how deeply the ritual had changed them. What frightened her most was not the guards with their rifles, nor the wire that ringed the camp. What frightened her was the realization that kindness could be more powerful than cruelty. That a brush, a bar of soap, a tube of lipstick could undo years of indoctrination more surely than any weapon. And in that realization lay a question that would haunt her every night. If everything she had been told was a lie, then who was she, and what remained of the world she thought she belonged to? The winter dragged on, but by early spring, the air inside the camp grew heavier, weighted not by snow or frost, but by whispers that spread like smoke. Rumors seeped through the barbed wire carried in by guards' stray comments, intercepted letters, or the muffled words of Red Cross workers who thought the prisoners did not understand. Berlin had been bombed again. Whole neighborhoods reduced to rubble. The Eastern Front was collapsing, the Soviets advancing mile by mile. The Reich, which they had been told was eternal, was crumbling faster than any of them could comprehend. Liesel Weber listened in silence, her hands folded around her knees at night, as the barracks filled with hushed voices. Some women clung to disbelief, shaking their heads, insisting it was Allied lies. But others wept openly, their sobs muffled against pillows or swallowed in the fabric of their coats. Marta, the proud widow who had once declared she would never bow to shame, collapsed one evening on her bunk, clutching a photograph of her son. "He is already gone," she whispered through her tears. "And now the city itself is gone too." The news broke them in ways no guard ever could. They were thousands of miles from home, but the war's devastation reached across oceans and fences, tearing into their hearts. Some prayed with desperate fervor. Others stared blankly into the dark, as if their eyes could see across continents, to the ruins of the lives they had left behind. Liesel herself thought of her mother alone in their shattered house in Bavaria. She pictured her picking through rubble, her hands raw from hunger and ash, and Liesel's chest constricted with a guilt so sharp it stole her breath. Yet even as grief hollowed them, Saturday afternoons still came. The guards led them across the yard to the familiar building where warmth and steam and fragrance awaited. The Salon had not vanished with the fall of cities. It persisted like a ritual divorced from the chaos beyond the wire. This time, however, the silence of the women was different. They no longer resisted, nor did they giggle shyly as before. They moved with a kind of solemnity, as though walking into a chapel. The American volunteers greeted them with the same cautious smiles, but they too seemed subdued, their hands gentler, their voices quieter. They knew by now the prisoners had heard the news. They knew that every brushstroke, every dab of color, was landing on faces shadowed by mourning. Still, they worked carefully, drawing combs through tangled hair, smoothing the sharp edges of nails, pressing soft shades of polish onto trembling fingers. And then came the lipstick. Always the lipstick. Its small cylinder passed from hand to hand crimson, against pale knuckles, a fragile torch lit in the midst of despair. The first woman to take it that day hesitated, tears streaking her cheeks. She shook her head, whispering, "How can I wear this when my home is ashes?" But the volunteer gently lifted her chin, brushing the color across her cracked lips with quiet determination. In the mirror, the woman gasped softly, her sob breaking into silence. She looked not like a prisoner, not like a mourner, but like herself, someone who still lived, still had a face worth seeing. The effect rippled through the room. One by one, women accepted the color, some reluctantly, some eagerly, as though clinging to it like a lifeline. When Liesel's turn came, she pressed her lips together after the red was applied, and she felt the tremor inside her chest. It was not vanity. It was survival. Each stroke was an act of defiance against despair, a reminder that they had not vanished with the cities that burned. In the quiet hum of that afternoon, a voice broke the silence. It was Marta, her eyes red-rimmed but steady, staring at her reflection with painted lips. "If the enemy still gives us lipstick in this moment," she whispered, "then the world we believed in has already fallen apart." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Some women flinched, others nodded slowly, as though admitting a truth they could no longer deny. The Reich, that had promised them glory and honor, had given them only rubble. And yet here across the ocean, in the hands of those they were told to hate, they were given back fragments of dignity. The contradiction tore at them. Shame and gratitude warred inside their hearts, twisting into something too complex to name. Some wept as they traced their lips in the mirror, others laughed bitterly through their tears. Liesel sat quietly, her reflection staring back at her, and for the first time she did not know who she was. She had been told she was a daughter of the fatherland, her worth measured by loyalty and sacrifice. But here in the chair of her captors she was simply a woman alive, with lips painted red as though to declare, "I am still here." The salon became something more than a place of grooming. It became a sanctuary, a fragile refuge where grief and dignity coexisted. Women clutched the magazines with trembling fingers, staring at kitchens filled with food. Families gathered in laughter. They compared those images to their memories of bombed streets, hunger lines, and air raid sirens. The gulf was unbearable, and yet it was undeniable. They began to practice English words more boldly, phrases clipped and awkward but full of longing. Thank you, pretty, alive. Words that bridged the distance between captor and captive, words that made them feel less like enemies and more like human beings. At night, the barracks buzzed with conversations that had once been impossible. Some women whispered of the possibility of life after the war, of rebuilding, of carrying what they had learned here back to the ruins of home. Others rejected it, still clutching their pride like a weapon. But their voices were fewer, their defiance thinner. Even they, in the privacy of darkness, touched their lips with reverence, unable to forget the feeling of being seen again. For Liesel, the truth came slowly but relentlessly. Each Saturday confirmed what she had begun to suspect: the power of cruelty was nothing compared to the power of kindness. She thought of the bombs falling on Berlin, the cries of children under rubble, the despair etched into every report. She thought of the Reich's promises of sacrifice and glory, all crumbling into ash. And then she thought of the lipstick pressed into her hand, the brush through her hair, the warmth of soap and water. It was not the Reich that had preserved her humanity. It was her enemy. The paradox was almost too much to bear. Tears stained her pillow at night as she wrestled with the guilt of accepting what had been offered. But the truth could not be denied. Lipstick had become their shield, a small, fragile line drawn between despair and survival. It was not decoration, it was resistance. It was a vow whispered in color that even when their world collapsed, they would not. By the time the sun set on another week, the women returned to their barracks with red lips and silent hearts. The snow crunched beneath their shoes, the wire still loomed above them, but something had shifted inside. The Reich might be collapsing, their families might be starving, their cities might be burning. But in the mirror of that salon, they had seen something war could not take. They had seen themselves alive, defiant human. And so, the lipstick became more than pigment, more than vanity. It became the symbol they carried in their pockets and in their souls. A reminder that dignity was not granted by governments or armies, but found in the simple insistence on being human, even when the world demanded otherwise. In every stroke of red, they found survival. In every reflection, they found proof that they were still more than prisoners, more than pawns of a dying empire. They were women who endured, and through that endurance, they reclaimed the smallest but most vital of victories, the right to still belong to themselves. In the end, what began as a march into fear became an unthinkable journey into contradiction. The German women who had stepped through the gates of captivity expecting humiliation instead found themselves confronted with the unfamiliar soap warmth, laughter, and even lipstick. Each week in that unlikely salon chipped away at the walls of propaganda and despair. For some, it was the first time they saw themselves not as prisoners of war, but as human beings worthy of dignity. For others, it was a haunting reminder of the lies they had been fed and the world that had collapsed behind them. And yet through tears, laughter, and red-painted lips, survival took on a new meaning. History often hides in details like these: the texture of a bar of soap, the touch of a brush through tangled hair, the flash of color on cracked lips. These fragments remind us that even in the darkest of wars, small acts of compassion can ignite powerful transformations. They force us to ask questions not only about the past, but about ourselves. How would we endure? What would we cling to? What symbols would we carry if the world around us fell into ruin? Now it is your turn to reflect. What do you think these women truly felt, caught between the ashes of their homeland and the unexpected humanity of their captors? Could a tube of lipstick really become more powerful than propaganda? Share your thoughts in the comments. Want to hear your perspective. And if this story stirred something in you, make sure to subscribe, because there are countless untold stories hidden in history's shadows. Each one carries secrets that will surprise you, move you, and perhaps even change how you see the world. Stay curious, because the past still has much to reveal.